Now, as I started off last week saying what a difference a week can make. 2 weeks ago we were talking about the Oilers being in the midst of a 5-game winning streak. They were absolutely on top of the world. A week ago we were talking about the Oilers being in the middle of a 3-game losing streak and they were down in the dumps. And now this week, if we were going to talk about how the season is going, we would be talking about the Oilers at the currently riding a 3-game winning streak. After a game against Calgary and 2 against Ottawa, including just a 7-1 just absolute destruction of the Senators earlier this week. But unfortunately, that isn't really what I'm going to talk about here. Unfortunately, it's been it's been a very hard year for the Oilers in terms of loss visiting the franchise. And so, of course, we saw that early in the summer this year, when very unexpectedly Oilers forward Colby Cave passed away. And that was absolutely devastating to the franchise, to the teams, to the fan base, to the players. And unfortunately, that was only really the beginning of it. They say that bad things happen in threes. And unfortunately, we saw that again in October when Joey Moss passed away. For decades, Joey Moss was very much, the heart and soul, maybe even the conscience of the Edmonton Oilers in a lot of respects. He passed away very suddenly. And despite the outpouring of public grief that you would expect when somebody like that leaves us, COVID has been a very bad time for these things to happen, and there was really not an opportunity for the public to come together and grieve this fabulous individual that we had just lost in October. And now this past week it's happened once again, and unfortunately once again it has happened during COVID. Wayne Gretzky's father, the legendary, the greatest hockey dad of all time, Walter Gretzky, passed away. He's had a lot of challenges with his health over the past several decades. That started, actually as early as in the 1990s when he had his aneurysm. Continued on with a battle of Parkinson's disease, and unfortunately, this past week was, that was finally it. Walter Gretzky's body just couldn't continue on. At a time like this, I can't even really imagine what it must be like to have known Walter Gretzky. I never had the opportunity to meet him. I did have an opportunity to very briefly meet Joey Moss. And, even such a short meeting as just a few minutes with a guy like Joey Moss definitely left, it definitely left a fingerprint on a person. I imagine that the same was true of Walter Gretzky, but I never had the opportunity to find that out myself. So I can't really imagine how it must feel right now to have known Walter Gretzky, because even as somebody who never got the opportunity to meet him, even I'm having difficulty, even almost a week later, even I'm having difficulty coming up with the words. I've spent portions of the last several days going back and trying to reacquaint myself with with perhaps best described as the idea of Walter Gretzky. It's hard to talk about the memory of Walter Gretzky if you didn't really know him, so I'm going to try to talk about the idea of Walter Gretzky and try to hone in on something that the idea of Walter Gretzky as a person can teach us. And I think that we would all have to presume that the guy that molded Wayne Gretzky, who is himself also one of the not only the best hockey player to ever live, but also really one of the best people to ever live. Somebody who molded a character like that into what he became, I think is somebody that we can all learn something from. And as I went back through all of those old stories about Walter Gretzky, the one that eventually kind of stood out in my mind was one that Wayne Gretzky told years later. And it was about a very early stage in Wayne Gretzky's career, right about the time when he was going out, and just as a teenager, as a young teenager, he was going out and he was scoring 400 goals in a season. Everybody already kind of knew that there was something to, there was already kind of a mythos of Wayne Gretzky. But not everybody was as well acquainted with that as other people were. So in particular, during the start of this one particular season, nobody really seems to nail this down with a year. But at the start of this season, Gretzky's team, they got called up and they got asked to play in an exhibition game. There was a team from a neighboring town that, his team never really went out and played very often. And so they hadn't had the opportunity to play against Gretzky. And so they said that they would do it, and so he went and he got his gear out of the basement, went out and played his first hockey game of that season, and apparently they just got absolutely destroyed. They described it as like an 8-1 drubbing. Probably not terribly dissimilar from the one that the Senators suffered here tonight. And so as the story goes, Walter had him in the car after the whole thing was over, and he said to him, well, how do you think that went? And Wayne, young Wayne, I should say, just kind of shrugged his shoulders and said, well, it was just an exhibition game. It's just an exhibition game. It wasn't important. And Walter said to him right there, that's not the way that you can think about something like this. And according to the story, Walter said to him that was not the way that he could think about this. For him, there were no unimportant games. Unimportant games, those are for people who don't have high expectations of themselves. Those are for people that other people don't have high expectations of them. If the expectations for you aren't all that high, well, then you can go out and you can take a night off and you can just kind of float around and just get by. Listening to the story, I got the impression that at that point, Walter Gretzky already had, not only did he already have some idea of who Wayne Gretzky was going to be, but I think that he also had some idea of who he wanted Wayne Gretzky to be. But maybe even more importantly than that, he had a very good idea of who Wayne Gretzky was going to want to be. He kind of had this sense that Wayne Gretzky was going to want to be somebody, who would go out and meet what the expectations of him were. And admittedly, for a player that young, that doesn't really seem fair. It doesn't seem like the expectations of such a young player would be so high. And really, it probably wouldn't even be the last time in hockey history where the expectations were that high. It's unfortunately not especially unusual that grown adults would have unreasonably high expectations of a teenaged hockey player. You see it all the time. You go to any rink in the country and it's pretty much right there fully on display. But regardless of whether or not you thought that the expectations were fair, the expectations were what the expectations were. And the expectations being what the expectations were. The way that Wayne Gretzky would describe it decades later was that he would basically say it felt like every single game at that point, and he was expected to show up and play like he was playing for the Stanley Cup. And so that was how he endeavored to play his career. And everybody around him seemed to understand that that was the way that Wayne Gretzky was just going to conduct his hockey career from that point forward. Even years later, when he was a pro with the Edmonton Oilers, if he ever got into the point where he was, struggling comparatively to what Wayne Gretzky's expectations of himself were, they always seemed to know exactly what it was that they should do in that situation. As it turns out, that the thing to do in that situation, every single time, was to go out, buy some airline tickets, put a seat in the building aside, give a call to Walter Gretzky and get him into the building, regardless of whether or not it was in Edmonton or whether it was out on the road. If Wayne Gretzky was struggling, there was one person in the world that they could always rely upon to get him back on the rails and get him back on track to where he wanted to be, and that person was Walter Gretzky.